GM, and welcome to our nightclub. Just kidding. Welcome to the DeFi State, a weekly show brought to you by Hashflow. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nicole Benham, the host of this show and head of community for Hashflow. I host this show with my co-host and the CEO of Hashflow, Varun. Today we have a very special guest, Natalie Brunell, who's host of Coin Stories podcast and The Hard Money Show. She's one of the most popular media commentators when it comes to Bitcoin and is also an Emmy Award-winning journalist. If you'd like to share this space with your friends, you can click on the arrow at the top right of the space, copy the link, tweet it out to your feed, text it to your friends, whatever works. Natalie, what's up? How are you?
Hi, Nicole. Thank you so much. That's such a nice introduction. I really appreciate it. How are you guys?
Of course, you're a beast. There's no other introduction. We're good. We're so excited to talk to you. The first time we're having you on this show.
I'm so excited. Yeah, we're going to get into it. Bitcoin, macro, there's so much going on. I can't believe that this bear market is now going like 400 days. Yeah, lots to talk about.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, thank you for coming by on the show. And I was like, okay, this is actually a very relevant topic anyway, because we've been like kind of. I tend to say that while it's called DeFi State and Bitcoin and Ethereum, whatever, at the end of the day, it's basically comes down to crypto and how do we fight the powers that be stealing time and energy from you to basically further their policy goals, and then how crypto is here to disrupt the powers that be. So I think this is a good time to again figure out, and just go back to the basics.
Yeah, Bitcoin is where it all started. So let's start there. Natalie, in terms of the price of Bitcoin and the way it's fluctuated over time, what are the key drivers with that?
Yeah, so I think that the two biggest drivers would be liquidity and education. And unfortunately, we're having problems with both right now, especially the liquidity, as the Federal Reserve makes the cost of borrowing more expensive by raising interest rates. So we've got a liquidity issue. We obviously had money printing pandemonium in response to the COVID pandemic. And that led to really bubbles in all the major asset classes, from equities to real estate and of course, crypto, because people had a lot of disposable income that they were ready to push into these different markets. And now, some of that excess is draining out, and it can be very, very painful. I think people learned a lot of really important lessons, especially in the crypto space this past year, with the contagion that happened with a lot of these companies. And we saw just how cross collateralized everything can get when one lender, has leverage with another, and things have they're essentially propped up by tokens that can be printed out of thin air, which should be really concerning to a lot of people. And then on the flip side, it's education. I think that a lot of people still conflate Bitcoin with crypto. I think a lot of people don't understand it. The people in the legacy financial system both don't understand it and have an incentive to maybe be against it if they do. Policymakers don't fully understand Bitcoin. We see that a lot, especially with things like the White House report on the climate impacts of crypto mining. They use resources like Dutch central bank bloggers for their information, as opposed to people in the industry and the science. And so we've got a lot of work to do. But at the same time, these bear markets are really good for building and for education. And I think that's what a lot of Bitcoiners are doing. They're sort of, hibernating and working on the important things, which are building and getting the right information out to the public. Right now, there's more incentive again for government intervention after the latest blow up with FTX. So I think there's going to be some fallout with that. And I think it's just really important right now to educate people, because these are actually, this is a good buy-in place. Your cost basis is much lower now than if you FOMO'd in at $60,000. I think it's hard for people who are very new and they may be purchased in at 40, 50, 60K. I orange pilled some friends and family members around that level, and you just have to remind them, this is the long game. You're playing the long game, and you have to remember that you can't have a short time horizon with a savings technology that's meant to build wealth in the long run and meant to return us to a pattern of saving as opposed to consuming and spending and going into debt.
I have a follow-up question there, Natalie. I think there's been a bunch of the discussions I've seen on the internet a while back where it said Bitcoin is essentially a hedge against inflation and so on. So do you think that's still true, or has it changed, or what was the reason why that was seen as a hedge against inflation, and if that is not the case anymore, what has changed, and do you think there's a strong correlation between Bitcoin and equities in traditional markets?
So again, I think that this is really about time horizons, because over the long run, I think Bitcoin is the greatest hedge against inflation. And if you look at Bitcoin over its existence over the last 13 years, it has been the best hedge against inflation and the increase in money supply. Right now, we are in tightening mode, and money has drained out from all the different asset classes. We've seen the stock market drop. Some stocks fell much harder than and went lower than Bitcoin. We see real estate coming down. But I actually really believe that this is temporary, because we are so far in debt, and there are so many issues on a global level, which maybe we'll get into on the macro side, that at some point there's going to be a credit issue. It might not be here in the US, it could be in Europe. We already saw issues in the UK bond market, the gilts. China might be where a credit issue happens. And once there's an issue with treasury liquidity, the Federal Reserve will have to come in and backstop it, and they will have to print and resume and pivot. And when that happens, that will be very inflationary, and it will start from a point where the so-called CPI, which I believe is a phony number anyway, it's not going to be at the 2% that they're used to. It might be at 4, 5, 6% in the new year, but they're going to have to print into higher inflation. And I think we've entered a decade that is structurally inflationary. And I think that, we will see Bitcoin go up when liquidity in the system increases again. And in the long run, I think that Bitcoin will go up and decouple from other risk on assets when people truly understand it. Bitcoin's penetration right now, I think globally, is only around 2%. I mean, think about that, right? We're at about $16,000 with 2% of the world's population on the Bitcoin network. So this technology is growing very quickly, and I still have a lot of faith in it in the long run. But right now we have a lot of headwinds, and so I think that in the new year we will have a change in Federal Reserve policy in response to what's happening globally. And I think that it won't be surprising in, the next decade to have double-digit inflation at some points. People think that it's going to go from 7% down to 2% and everything will be all and well again. I don't believe that to be the case.
Natalie, earlier you said that, this is a good time for building. There's a lot of stuff happening. So 2 questions. One, how is Bitcoin being used in the real world? What are examples of some of its adoption? But also, what should we be paying attention to in terms of what's being built on top of Bitcoin?
Yeah, so I think the layer 2 technology is really where a lot of the innovation's happening with the Lightning Network. Right now, there are incubators like Wolf from if people are familiar with the company NYDIG, they're creating an opportunity for people from around the world, Lightning developers from around the world, to come to New York City and work on how to grow and develop this network. There are companies building like Fedimint. There are lots of companies really that are using this bear market to grow. And really where I think the most innovation and the most adoption is going to happen is via that layer 2, the ability to transact, the ability for businesses to adopt Bitcoin so that they can avoid, those high fees from intermediaries like Visa and MasterCard, so that they can keep more of whatever they sell. And I think in general, in the real world, there's a big difference between how the West views Bitcoin and uses Bitcoin and in the developing countries where inflation is even higher. We have a lot of problems here. We have high inflation, we have growing wealth gap, we have more and more wealth disparity, and I believe that the policies that have been in place for the last 2 decades have really crushed the middle class and savers and people who really just want to achieve the American dream. But overseas, in a lot of places, it's even worse. Countries like Lebanon, they've seen their purchasing power collapse by about 90%. And in real time, Bitcoin is actually helping people subvert these oppressive governments and high inflation and be able to create circular economies. And whether you're talking about Central American nations or places in Africa or places in the Middle East, people are using Bitcoin in real time to escape their current financial system or to have access for the very first time to one. It's banking the unbanked. And so I think that it's actually really inspiring to look at cases in other countries. There's a really great book written by Alex Gladstein that's called Check Your Financial Privilege, that goes into how Bitcoin is helping people in places like Guatemala and in Cuba and Kenya and Afghanistan. I have a girlfriend who used to work for the Human Rights Foundation, and she used Bitcoin to help Ukrainian refugees escape to Poland, and they were able to travel with their wealth. I spoke to a CEO from Afghanistan named Roya Mahbub, who would help people have access to transportation out of the country when the Taliban took over. They didn't have access to their banks. There was a run on the banks and the Taliban took over, and they were able to actually help their families escape because they had Bitcoin. And so there are lots of, real world examples of how Bitcoin is helping people. And there was just the very first inaugural Bitcoin conference in Africa, which I was so sad to miss this month. I hope to go next year, but Africa is where the fastest adoption is actually happening. And there's been one nation so far, the Central African Republic, that has legalized Bitcoin as tender because their own currency has been collapsing in purchasing power, and it's really controlled by another nation's treasury. I don't know if a lot of people are aware of this, but there are currencies in Africa that are controlled by, for example, the French treasury, and they debase it, and really people suffer. And there's a lot of information going out about how much damage the World Bank and the IMF have done by giving out loans that have really high interest rates that really crush these countries. And then people, don't have access to opportunity and to gain prosperity. And Bitcoin is helping change all of that. It's helping democratize the system and allow people access to be able to bank with one another. So I'm actually really inspired by all the real world applications. And again, at this price, it is an easier way to sort of buy in. You can get more for your money, so to speak, when it goes up than you could have when it was 60,000.
Natalie, thank you so much for the response. I think I had a quick follow-up there. I think you mentioned something. I think the question here goes down to how important do you think is the government's recognition of a Bitcoin as a legal tender? Because one of the reason why Bitcoin is attractive is because it cannot be manipulated by any central powerful government, right? So it cannot be manipulated or controlled to achieve any policy goals. So in that, if that's the case, but then how important do you think it is for it to be recognized as a legal tender? And if not, how do you envision that to be to shape up in the future?
Well, I think that this is going to change over time, and I think we're going to see the smaller countries first who have been the most impacted by the dollar being the global reserve currency and being sort of on the end of that spectrum, trying to produce and provide economic value in a world where the US dollar and the West dominate. So I think that those countries have more incentive to look at Bitcoin and to adopt it, just like El Salvador did. And they have less to lose, I would say. They have far more to gain on this asymmetric opportunity. But I think in the long run, I see everyone adopting Bitcoin in every country, and because it can't be manipulated, because it can't be controlled, because it's a lot like the internet in its sort of functioning and opportunity, I don't believe that it can be stopped. And if and when it does, that shows that you have an authoritarian regime that's trying to take control and concentrate power. So I don't think that America will ever go in that direction. Countries like China, yes, certainly. Other, states where there are dictators, absolutely. They will not like Bitcoin and they will try to prevent their citizens from using it. But In the long run, I think that most places will allow it to be a part of the economy, and it's certainly bringing jobs and innovation, especially within the mining space. And whether a country legalizes it as tender or not, I still think that Bitcoin adoption will continue to grow, and people will see it as both a savings technology as well as a medium of exchange that helps them, you know, get beyond the intermediaries that all want to take a cut. And I'm not sure when the United States will legalize it as tender. I know that some states were trying to propose bills to do so individually, but I'm not. That's not something that that worries me when it comes to whether Bitcoin will be adopted on a global level.
Huh. I didn't know actually so there were states that were already doing that. But I think I would be under the impression though if you think if that US they would be very willing to adopt that as a legal tender. I would imagine, but since dollar is like one of the most dominant currencies around the world, wouldn't they see this as a threat if it goes that direction? Do you think they will try to oppose it, or do you think they would do it? Because I would imagine in a logical world, it's in the best interest of the US to adopt Bitcoin as the currency because it actually just does more good than harm, right? At the same time, for the longest time, we've spent all these resources to maintain the dominance of dollar around the world.
Mm-hmm.
So this kind of goes against the older everything that we've done so far as a nation, as the US, right? I wonder what your thoughts are in that case.
Yeah, so I might be in the minority on this, but I actually think that Bitcoin could be a huge advantage right now as opposed to a threat to the dollar. We had so much power because of the fact that we created the petrodollar and we became the global reserve currency that everyone had to use and transact with. We created this global demand for our currency, and times are changing, and we saw that. And I think when we weaponized the dollar through sanctions recently, especially with Ukraine, I think we have incentivized other countries to move onto a different system. And if you look at things like BRICS that are, being developed, and if you look at what's happened recently with Saudi Arabia and Russia and China with regards to what currencies they will use to pay for oil and commodities, we've really done this to ourselves, unfortunately. And sometimes when we have a monopoly over something, we really take for granted that position of power. And more people actually live in the BRICS nations than in the West as far as population. So these countries are kind of coming together and saying, well, if the US can literally just sanction us and tell us that they're going to confiscate our reserves, maybe we don't want our reserves in US dollars and US treasuries, right? So countries we've seen around the world have been de-dollarizing. China has not been purchasing US treasuries for a while, as well as Russia. If people want to look at something really interesting, go back and listen to speeches that President Putin has made a decade ago, saying that the US dollar and the global reserve system that is currently in place is a parasite on the global economy. And so he was stocking his reserves with gold. And I think that a lot of this, the chess moves were in motion a long time before this war broke out and really changed what the game looks like for us, the US, as a superpower. And we have to remember too, we have shipped off a lot of our manufacturing, right, to other countries where it's cheaper because of that Triffin's dilemma, because the dollar is the global reserve currency. So now we're in a position where we are sort of weakening as a nation. We still have a very powerful military, but it's funded by debt. We don't have enough taxpayer receipts to actually fund what we're spending here in this country, and we've shipped off manufacturing of goods to other places, and we're not allowing for our country to have the freedom to liberate sources of energy like oil anymore. So we're in a predicament, and I think something like Bitcoin can actually strengthen us. I think we need to return to a system of money that is based on something real, something of value, not not continually going further and further into essentially borrowing against our futures, but something that's based on math and the law of physics, which is Bitcoin. I don't believe that we'll ever go on a gold standard again, but our dollars should be backed by something. They should have real value. And so I think that if we do adopt Bitcoin and we do, open up the U.S. to be a center for mining and for innovation and for these companies to flourish, we could once again be the greatest source of prosperity that the other nations around the world will look to. And we could actually save the dollar. I think other currencies could collapse into the dollar, and the dollar could be, on one separate rail as sort of the payment mechanism, and then Bitcoin could be the savings technology. So you have a wallet where you transact in dollars and you save in Bitcoin. I could see a world like that. But I think the direction we're going in currently, with policymakers that I believe don't understand enough about geopolitics and economics and the history of money, we're going in the wrong direction, and other countries are going to be able to take advantage of that. So for me, I actually think that Bitcoin can save the dollar and can return that sense of the American dream. It can provide a renaissance for that. So that's why we're really, really working hard in the Bitcoin space to educate every policymaker at the local, state, and federal levels.
Thank you, Natalie. One question that I had was, obviously there are, some debates and controversies within and outside of the Bitcoin community. What are they and how are they being addressed?
So I don't really know of controversies within the Bitcoin community. I think the biggest thing is just, we really want to educate people on the difference between Bitcoin and crypto, so that there is really a separation of the idea of, crypto commodities, crypto securities, cryptocurrencies in the form of maybe stable coins, crypto art. I think that a lot of people just conflate everything, and they see Bitcoin as equal to any of the other altcoins, which I think, is indicative of not understanding the underlying technology and how truly rare and how truly unique it was that we were able to build a system that is now so decentralized and so secure. It's really, it's open source, so anyone can replicate it. There are essentially, thousands, if not tens of thousands of copies to Bitcoin, but it's really difficult to gain that network effect and that power to truly diffuse itself enough around the world that it is decentralized, that no one can 51% attack the ledger, and to be secured by this hash power that keeps growing and growing. And even though we're in a bear market, we've been hovering around all-time high hash rates, which means the Bitcoin network has never been more secure. And with the other projects and innovations that are in the space, I don't focus on them, because for me, they don't have the properties of money that Bitcoin has. And my primary concern is whether people are really educated on the current financial system, the problems with it, why it doesn't provide enough access and opportunity, and why it's not creating abundance for everyone, and the problems with inflation, and how Bitcoin really tackles that. With everything else, it's not my focus, because I see it as so truly different from Bitcoin, and I don't think that they're in the same category or really compete. So that's the only thing. I don't really call it a controversy. I just think, again, it's just, this space. There's this term cryptocurrency, and I think a lot of things get lumped into it. And I think in the future, maybe there will be some clarity, because Bitcoin's the only piece of that technology that I see as money, whereas the rest I see as kind of digital equities, platforms, again, art. I think there will be NFTs and art tokens, and I think that there will be different projects that are created in the ecosystem. But I don't believe that any of them will be a savings technology or a global, property rights vehicle the way that Bitcoin is.
Now, I think the way I see it is Bitcoin is likely the most depoliticized money out there, right? I don't think anything else comes close to that. But I think many people argue that anything could be money. Enough people agree upon that. So this is a dumb question for you. Is this what are some of the properties that you think make Bitcoin the most depoliticized money there is, and others maybe not quite so?
Yeah, so I mean, if you go back to sort of the basics, which I think is really, really important, I think that, money has to be able to be a store of value. It has to keep the same properties over time, which in this case, because of the fact that it's literally math and physics, Bitcoin stores its value 1,000 years into the future. It's not something that can ever deteriorate. It's not something that's going to change, and no one can debase it, because it's not inflationary like our fiat currency. It's divisible, it's portable, it's fungible. I mean, when there's these charts that you can actually Google where it compares these different properties of what makes good money, and you can see Bitcoin in one category, gold in another, and fiat in another. And really, Bitcoin always has the best track record. The only thing it doesn't have on its side is really time. Gold was money for like 1,500 years, so obviously it has time on us. But as far as portability, divisibility, fungibility, all of these things, I think Bitcoin has basically revolutionized what money can be through technology. And I think that more education needs to get out to the general public about the divisibility, I think, because most people see Bitcoin, they see its price, and they think that it's out of reach for them. And really, Satoshis are sort of the unit that I think we should start using more as Bitcoiners, because you can buy 100 Satoshis for very little. And if in a world where we transact more and more with Bitcoin, I think we'll actually be transacting in sats or Satoshis. And really, for me too, the scarcity of it is the big one. You can't, it's that like unforgeable costliness that Nick Szabo has talked about. You can't just be able to make it out of thin air, which is the opposite of pretty much almost any other type of money. You can hit a button and make a bunch of dollars, or hit a button and make a bunch of FTT tokens like Sam Bankman-Fried did. And even with something like gold, the inflation rate is like 2%. And I think there was a headline earlier this year that they found some gold mine, and we don't even know how much gold there is in the earth. We have no idea if at some point someone will tap in and find a massive supply. And a lot of that because of its size and its lack of portability. It gets centralized into the reserves of nations, and then bank notes get issued on top of it. And so Bitcoin's not like that. You can literally run a node on any computer around the world. Anyone has access to it. You can see the ledger, and every 10 minutes, the amount of Bitcoin that's out there in circulation gets settled, and the ownership. So I think that Bitcoin has all of these really fantastic properties, but most people don't really think that deeply about money, which is interesting. I certainly didn't. I didn't understand money until I learned about Bitcoin. And now I think about, what makes good money all the time. And I see the actions, our government takes, and I think how poor it is for the average person in terms of maintaining the value of their money, and this sort of idea of, the energy that we put when we labor, that's our energy. And we want to store it in something that's not going to be debased, manipulated, that's not going to rot, that's not going to corrode, that's not going to be taxed at 2 to 3% every single year until it's gone. We want something that's going to last into the future. And so for me, Bitcoin is actually the best engineered and the most ethical form of money that I've ever studied.
Yeah, there was an interesting point that you brought up about gold, how we could potentially find a supply somewhere, and we don't know how much gold there is. It's like we're assuming scarcity instead of knowing that there is scarcity, which we do have with Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was super interesting. How do governments and regulatory bodies around the world approach Bitcoin and crypto regulation?
Yeah, so this is where I think education is so important. We need to inform our policymakers about this technology, because otherwise we're going to get bills like Elizabeth Warren's that was just proposed in the wake of FTX, where she essentially wants to, KYC everybody, turn everyone into brokers, and really just directly attack personal freedom and sovereignty and property rights. And that's what made this country great, right? These fundamental values and ideals of individual freedom, your ability to hold your property and have that be protected. And so that goes really her bill, and a lot of the legislation that's been proposed, it goes against that, more in the direction of control and surveillance. That's why I really don't like CBDCs. And again, it's like, we really have to inform people these are not good. This means that you're going to have programmable money that's controlled by the state, by the government, and they can tell you when and how you can spend it. You can essentially go out to a business, and you know what, if it's something that they don't like, whether it's some sort of vice that you're purchasing, or an organization you're supporting, maybe they'll tax you more on it. Maybe they'll take away your ability to transact, like what happened in Canada with the people who donated to the Canadian truckers. And this idea of programmable money, in the sense that literally your money could expire. They could give you stimulus, but if you don't spend it in a certain time, they take it away from you. You can't even save. I mean, that's a really dystopian future that I want us to avoid. And Bitcoin really empowers that idea of individual sovereignty and freedom and being able to store your property, your money, long into the future with no one able to confiscate it from you or debase it through inflation. And I think that we now have more, again, kind of an incentive to intervene as far as policymakers go because of what happened with this fallout, with people losing so much money. But I'm not worried about Bitcoin because the CFTC, the SEC, the leaders that are really informed about this, they've already said that Bitcoin is the only cryptocurrency that is a commodity. And it is essentially a form of property. That's why it's taxed the way that it is. And the others, I think, will be under more scrutiny as far as securities laws go, because if there is this idea of a common enterprise and there are people that could potentially affect the network, and if people are basically working to gain profit by impacting the network, well, that falls in line with securities laws. And there's nothing wrong with securities at all. Every stock that most people have in their 401k portfolios, they are securities. But what happened was those companies had to go through a really arduous process that's oftentimes very, very expensive of letting people know who's in the leadership roles, how what kind of risk is involved for investors, and how really the companies work and function. And so I think that that will eventually happen. I think that, people who want to build in this space in the form of a digital security, they will have to let investors know what the structure of the company looks like and what risks there are. Sometimes those documents could be thousands of pages long, and there's going to be lawyers involved in all of that and compliance, which FTX, as we saw, didn't have any of that, right? They created an FTT token, which was a digital security. It was controlled by Sam. Sam could press a button and he could create more FTT tokens. And then he used that. What was the most diabolical thing about what he did is he used it as collateral. He used it as money. He basically counterfeited money and used it to take out loans and spend money. And he commingled it with people's funds, that people who actually gave him US dollars or Bitcoin. And that's what's really sad, and that should not be allowed, and it should be punished when someone commits that type of fraud. So I think in the future we will have a lot more clarity when it comes to this space. What is a commodity? What is a security? How do you register? I mean, the fact is the SEC and the CFTC could have prevented some of this by just saying, hey, if you want to create a cryptocurrency, a crypto security, here's how to do it. Here's what information we need from you. Here is a proper way to register it. And then investors can decide, do they want to invest in it or not? But to do what Sam did and go offshore, because obviously he wouldn't have been able to get away with it here, to go offshore, create a token, manipulate the price, trade it with himself, become the market maker, use it as collateral, cross-collateralize it, go buy off politicians. That's not okay. That's not okay. And if regulation helps, then I'm for it. I'm not worried about regulation when it comes to digital property and things that are ethical, like Bitcoin.
Natalie, is it safe to say here in this scenario that a token or something being a security is not a bad thing? But at the same time, the reason why people are so freaked out about that is because generally, the reason people don't go that route to begin with is because registering a token or anything as security is a lengthy process, and it takes years to do that. And because there's not a easy framework for people to do it, as a result, they go the other way of not pursuing that part. And in the course, we end up with situations like FTX and so on. So if we actually had a framework that makes it easy for people to even register tokens as securities, let's say it takes a month or two, then perhaps a token being a security is not a bad idea. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
This is just speculation, right? So,
I absolutely don't think there's anything wrong with securities. There's nothing wrong with Google stock or Apple stock or Tesla stock, and whether people want to invest in those is their option. I'm a huge proponent of freedom, especially when it comes to investing. If people want to go to the casino and spend all of their money at the casino, that is their right, as long as they're not impacting anything I'm doing with my money. So I absolutely agree with you. There is nothing wrong with securities, but there is something wrong with being unethical and creating something that you are manipulating, which is what Sam did, right? He manipulated the token. He dumped it on the public after manipulating the price. And then he used retail funds to go spend, trade. I mean, he essentially went on a joyride, and that's not okay. I mean, we have to remember that the framework that exists for current securities, for stocks, it's in place to protect people so that they understand what the company is, what the structure looks like, what decisions are made, and how. And there's a sense of, you know, leadership and centralization and control, and you have to be aware of that when you buy in. When you buy into some kind of, you know, token that someone has control of, and you know nothing, it's completely opaque, and it's offshore on top of that, so it can subvert all different laws in different nations. Well, you could get in trouble. And so whose fault is that? You know, at the end of the day, I think that personal responsibility is really important. You have to educate yourself, because a lot of people don't go crying for regulation until they lose everything. But we don't have a framework currently. So these companies, you know, they create the cryptocurrencies because right now there's a huge, it's a wild west, and these things can take off and, you know, make a 1,000,000% in returns, and then they can come crashing down and hit zero. That's a very dangerous game to play, especially if you don't understand the technology. And I don't like when people create something that they masquerade as money, when it's really something that is they're, you know, pumping and dumping on the public to enrich themselves. For me, that is unethical. And at the end of the day, why I love Bitcoin is because when you go to the ground, when you go to the sand level and you really dig into how this technology works, it is the most secure, the most technically sound, the most economically sound, and the most ethically sound piece of technology in the ecosystem, which is why I trust it. And I didn't feel that way at the beginning. When I entered the space in 2017, I thought all of it was kind of a scam, or I could lose a bunch of money. It's all kind of like gambling. I invested a little in different altcoins. And again, it was from that sort of fiat mentality that I want to make money. I want to make the most money possible with the least amount of effort, right? I mean, that's why a lot of people look at the space and it's attractive, because they see, oh my gosh, someone put in $1,000 and overnight or in a couple of months, they made hundreds of thousands or millions on some token. But what do they want to do at the end? They want to sell it for the US dollars, or they want to put it into Bitcoin. They don't want that token, because in the end, that token was worthless. They're not going to use it, spend it, save it. And at the end of the day, that's creating sort of this like horse race where someone's going to be left holding the bag. And oftentimes those people are not people who can afford it. And that's really sad. And I think our current system is to blame for that, because people want to outpace the rising cost of everything. They want to outpace inflation. Everybody's chasing yield, chasing gains. And that's a sad world, because we have no safe place to store our economic value and energy. So I think we shouldn't replicate the system of fiat within crypto. We should be honest with what people are building. We should be honest with what they are. If they're securities, then be honest about it and let people decide if they want to invest in you. And if they are a true commodity like Bitcoin, then let's have a framework again to recognize that, so that people can make smart decisions individually based on whatever their risk tolerance is. Like, I just think that there just needs to be more transparency and you know, accessibility to this whole system. And fiat, unfortunately, has destroyed our monetary system to such a degree that people are willing to just like put a little bit in all these different things that they don't fully understand, hoping to get rich overnight, so that they don't have to worry about, you know, whatever they're trudging along doing in their daily lives. And that's sad. That's sad that we look at the world in that way, especially in a country like America. I think that what I hope for in the future that I'm trying to build is this idea that people create value, they work, they take risk. I mean, this is the idea of capitalism, right? Risk should be rewarded, but also punished when the idea is not one that people find value in. I like this idea of competition and value, supply and demand being based on real prices and real interest rates. And we don't have that system. It's sort of rigged. And the last thing I'll say on this, because I find this to be a really good analogy. I was listening to an interview with Mark Moss yesterday, and he said, you know, we all get mad at the really rich people today, like the Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk. We're like, that's not fair, and he he should give us some of his wealth. Like he should redistribute it. And this is more of I think a move on one side of the political spectrum, but it's this idea that it's not fair. You have so much, give it back to us. But what Mark said is no one's mad that, LeBron James or the best athletes, Messi, no one's mad about the tens of millions of dollars that they make. Well, why is that? And he said it's because when you are talking about sports, there's a set of rules and you can't skirt those rules. There's just a set of rules, and some people climb, and through merit, through competition, someone ends up being on top and someone's the best. And you can't fault them for it because they played by the rules. But in the current system, the rules are rigged. They're not accessible to everyone. They're not the same for everyone. They are rigged to advantage the people at the top. They are rigged to advantage people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk because they already have so much money, and so they have easier access to capital, to loans, and they can further maximize their profits. They can socialize their losses, and so that system's not fair, and it creates frustration and populism. And so I think that's why we have this crypto revolution, because so many people are like, I want a seat at the table. This is not fair, and I want a chance. I want a shot. Well, the rules in Bitcoin are fair. They're transparent. They're there, and no one can change them. Whereas if there's a token or anything else out in the space, just be honest. What are the rules? And can someone change it? Can there be a 51% attack? Or is there a small group that's deciding what the code's going to be so you can unstake your coins in 5-10 years? Just be honest. I think more people would appreciate everyone who has a leadership position or business position or politics position to just be honest with what you're doing and how you're doing it.
I love that analogy that Mark Moss gave. I saw a video by Robert Kiyosaki. Remember him, the Rich Dad Poor Dad guy? And he was giving that same, the difference between people like Donald Trump. I know he infuriates a lot of people, but it's a good example of someone else who's also using these like loopholes and stuff. And he's like, we're just studying different things.
Mm-hmm.
We're just studying different things. And I was like, that is so, so true. And then that concept of rules, that people don't get mad when there are rules in place that you have to abide by.
Right.
That's so interesting. What a great, wow. Natalie, God, I have so many more questions. I don't even know which direction to take this in. How has the pandemic and economic downturn impacted the demand for Bitcoin and the market?
Yeah, so I mean, it's been an interesting 2 years for sure, because we saw money printing, which has been happening for the last decade. We've had QE. So Bitcoin was actually born into a QE environment. This is a very interesting time for it, because as the Federal Reserve and the government tries to tighten, that really changes things for Bitcoin. It's not used to anything but QE. So I think we have to be, very honest with ourselves in the fact that Bitcoin has benefited from the very loose monetary policy that we saw over the last decade. So now the cost of borrowing is going up, the interest rates are going up. We haven't seen a crush in the labor market, which is why the Federal Reserve has not made a pivot. We don't have unemployment going up or spiking. And so liquidity is tough. It's a lot of it is drained out of the system, and we've seen that happen with Bitcoin. And then it was exacerbated by the fact that we had this crypto contagion, where Bitcoin, as this neutral asset that is pristine collateral, is sort of at the base of that. And unfortunately, when you have a bunch of air tokens that suddenly go to zero and there's a bank run on whatever the crypto exchange is, people have to sell their Bitcoin. And so it's further put pressure on the Bitcoin price in a downward trend. But I mean, at the end of the day, Bitcoin in every bear market has drawn down, 70, 80%. I don't think we've come down as far as we have in previous markets. That said, I believe we have more pain ahead, especially because of the macro environment. And yet Bitcoin's still $16,000-$17,000 a Bitcoin. I think over these years, it has proven itself. And I think that when the next bull run happens, it can happen very quickly, that Bitcoin gains tens of thousands of dollars, and we will eventually reach a new all-time high. I actually put out a poll, I think like a week or so ago. I said, do you think that Bitcoin will ever reach a new all-time high? And overwhelmingly, more than 80 or 90% said yes. Well, if you believe that, then you should definitely have at least a small percentage of your portfolio in Bitcoin, right? But I think that the macro stuff is just really, really interesting because again, I think it's going to continue to be very volatile. As I mentioned earlier, the Federal Reserve, they're not seeing unemployment go up, so they're not pivoting. They're continuing to raise interest rates, and Jay Powell has this, has this bold statement that he says they're gonna lift them up to say a Fed funds rate near 5% and then leave it there. It's going to be very hard for him to maintain that stance. And why is that? Well, primarily it's because our deficit is growing. They actually did sort of like a chicken pivot in October, and they actually increased Treasury liquidity because they had to, because things were at risk of locking up the way that they did in the UK. And we have tax receipts falling. So you have to remember, I mean, when we had that economic boom because of all the money printing responding to the pandemic, we had a lot of people flood money into the equities and real estate, and they spent a lot on their fiscal stimulus that they got in the form of direct checks. And so what does that mean? Well, GDP went up significantly and tax receipts went up significantly. So now that we're tightening and everyone is basically back on credit cards, tax receipts are falling, and they're falling faster than the Federal Reserve wants, and faster than I believe that they will be able to keep up with in the long run. Meanwhile, our interest rate expense is basically coming close to our obligation for Social Security, and we will not be able to service that debt. We don't have enough coming in to be able to service that debt, and we're increasing our borrowing, so we're increasing our deficit. So this is why people refer to that debt spiral or debt doom loop, because at a certain point, we need to print again. We need to go further and further into debt. And that's the only way that we can sustain what we've done to the U.S. dollar and to the treasuries. We have to continue to inflate the debt away. So what does that mean? At some point, whether that's 3 months from now, 6 months from now, 12 months from now, the Federal Reserve, which has way too much power in the price of money around the world, they're going to say, whoopsie daisy, we gotta change things. We gotta lower the interest rates. And like I mentioned earlier, I believe that they're going to have to print into already high inflation. What does that mean? Inflation could go higher. So I think we've hit in this cycle, we've hit the high, which was, the 9%. But I don't believe that over the next decade, that will be the high watermark. I think we will go higher. I think we will have higher CPI than we've seen in the next cycle. And so I think people need a brace for that. I think that's why a lot of analysts are talking about, not just Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is a form of digital commodity money, but also commodities in general. I think we've kind of shifted from a growth stocks cycle to a commodities cycle. Everyone was pouring money into the big tech dream stocks, and it didn't matter it was all about valuations. It didn't matter what the profits were or what the underlying, strength or foundation of the company was. It was like, what was the valuation and what's the potential of this company to grow when the money's easy and the money's flowing? Well, now it's shifted. It's like, well, what are the profits? What is this company actually doing? What are the costs? So I think, I have a fire alarm, but I think that things will change into more of a commodities cycle where things like energy, oil, precious metals, and Bitcoin as a commodity will be more important in this decade.
Oh my God, the fire alarm.
It's not an issue. Don't worry. It's been happening every single day for the last 3 days.
How long does it last?
Like 10 minutes.
Wait, so you have to listen to that for 10 minutes every single day?
For the last 3 days, yes.
Oh, wow. Do they warn you about this?
No, I think it's just a glitch. Sorry, guys.
No worries. No worries. It's totally fine. I do have some more macro questions, but before I ask, because there's a lot of people in here who are messaging me who know nothing about Bitcoin or crypto or any of that. When you meet someone who knows nothing but is looking to learn, what direction do you point them in? What resources, what books, or are there any, because I just point everyone to you. But
thank you.
But yeah, who do you point people to?
No, that's a really great question, and I appreciate it because I love teaching people about Bitcoin and sort of the fundamentals. And so, what I do a lot now is I go to companies and organizations, and I do seminars and I do talks where I explain it from the perspective of here's our current system, here's the history of money. So it's essentially here's the problem, why it's a problem, and show context and statistics, and here's why Bitcoin is the best solution I can find. I could be wrong, but I can't find anything that is a better solution than Bitcoin at this current time after studying it for more than 1,000 hours. And the way I studied it is through books and podcasts and YouTube videos. So, the first one that I always recommend to people is the Bitcoin Standard. That was really the starting point for me. And it was really an aha moment for me. If anyone's heard me kind of talk about my Bitcoin journey, when I read the Bitcoin Standard, I was like, oh my gosh, I have to unlearn half of what I thought I knew. I never thought about inflation before. I never thought about the word inflation prior to learning about Bitcoin. And really, we never really heard about it in the news until the pandemic, right? Because they printed so much money, they gave us the fiscal stimulus, and now on everyone's mind, inflation. It was never an issue in other elections and in media headlines in the years prior to this. Now suddenly we hear about inflation. Well, is inflation good? How much do we actually have inflation? Because if you look at things like assets, like equities, the S&P 500 was going up like 7-8% on an annual basis. And so our money supply was increasing, and I would argue that our inflation rate on a yearly basis over the last decade was actually closer to a 7, 8, even 10%. That's how much our money supply was expanding, and how much you had to pay extra in order to purchase things like a house or something in your stock portfolio. So that means we've actually had high inflation. The cost of your money, your dollar, has been going down, and so you start to peel back the layers, and you go, why is that? And who's in control? And why is our country going so far into debt? Is there anything backing it? And what are other countries doing? So you start to ask these very, very important, questions that really lie at the heart of all of our interactions as humans, because the economy is how we all interact with one another. And what is at the base layer of that? Well, it's money. It's the most important critical piece of information. And so if our money's broken, and if our money system is based on who's at the top and how much money they decide to press a button and print, there's something very broken about that, and it really impacts people. It crushes people that mostly are in the middle. The people that are, the fabric of this country. I think the middle class has really taken a hit over the last 10 years. And we're sort of programmed to think, well, but our house has gone up in value. Well, how great is it that your house has gone up in value when you go to sell it, you have to buy a house that's so much more expensive as well. And your kids that graduate from college can't even try to buy a house. They've basically been resigned to being renters. That's not a fair system. That's not one that creates abundance and prosperity. That's a rigged system that creates the haves and the have-nots. I'm very against that, and I think that more people should be very critical of our current monetary system and listen to the great voices like Lynn Alden, Luke Groman, Preston Pish. These people that are really critically analyzing what current monetary policies are doing, and then learn about Bitcoin through books like The Bitcoin Standard, Price of Tomorrow, The Bullish Case for Bitcoin by Vijay Boyapati, Hard Money You Can't F With by Jason Williams. There's so many books. The Little Bitcoin book by Jason Jimmy Song. There's so many books. I have a list of resources on my website, talkingbitcoin.com, and it links to all the different books and podcasts that I recommend. So I hope that's a good start for people. But you really have to start by understanding why the current system's broken to understand why you need to, learn about Bitcoin to appreciate it.
I love that. Thank you, Natalie. I remember I followed Lynn Alden because of you, and her analogy of FTT token to clown bucks was like the best I had seen when that happened.
Oh my gosh, completely.
Yeah, so the sentiment in this industry is a little obviously we're bullish, but the sentiment for everyone else is a little skeptical. I'm looking right now on the timeline on Twitter, and everyone's posting about how SBF posted bail for $250 million right now, and everyone's like, what the hell? There's a lot going on, but there's also a lot of good things happening and things that we're excited about. And so I want to end with what are you most excited about in terms of the trajectory of Bitcoin and blockchain technology?
I am just really excited about having more people learn about this so that they can finally use it and get value out of it, whether that's as a savings mechanism, which I think is so important for all of us to, really pivot back to that idea of planning for your future and being able to save. And then, like I mentioned earlier, in other countries, in real time, using this as a medium of exchange to have access to a financial system that's fair, one that can't be manipulated by rulers, and that allows people to create these like circular economies and start to create value for one another and build wealth. Because I think that is so needed in a lot of these countries where things have been even worse for so long. For me, as silly as this might sound, like I have so much hope in Bitcoin, just because it's, at the end of the day, to me, it's so simplistic in that it's a form of money that is truly scarce, that's truly decentralized, that you can count on in the long run because it's just based on math and the law of physics, and it requires a cost to produce it. You can't just print it out of thin air. It requires energy, and energy is at the base layer of everything we do in this world. And I think, our money is our energy, our labor is our energy, our love, all of it is energy. And I think that Bitcoin is this amazing gift that was given to the world to make it a more accessible, fair place. And I don't mean fair as in everyone gets the same, amount of the pie. I mean, you have to work and provide value. You will be judged based on that value in a fair way. And then you will get the kind of the slice that's based on the value you've provided. It's not going to be, if you're rich, you get even more. If you're poor, you're going to be even more poor. Like, it's a more meritocratic system. I think that will create the most opportunity and abundance for everybody. And I want to live in that world where I'm challenged and there is real competition and there are fair rules to the game, and you perform based on your own abilities, and you have the motivation to get better and to work harder. Whereas today, I feel like motivation to work hard is going away, right? And we kind of see it. If anyone in this whole room has been the victim of customer service recently, it's like nobody cares anymore, because that job that they have it's thankless. They don't get paid enough to afford whatever they need to afford. And so I feel like the world is going into this place where everyone is retreating into their silos. We're on team this or team that. It's us against them. I don't think that that's the world that we have to live in. I think if our money is fair and ethical and based on rules that can't be manipulated, our world will reflect that. If our money is rotten at its core, the world will feel rotten around us, and people will have their worst traits and vices amplified. But if the money is fair and we all are incentivized to cooperate and collaborate with one another for peace, we will have a beautiful, abundant world. I really do believe that. And so that's why I'm really passionate about this, because I want to fight for that. I want to fight for that type of future for when I have a family and when I have kids. I want it to be a world that I contributed to for the good, for the better of everybody, as opposed to a world where I just, blamed everything on someone else, got upset, only focused on myself. I don't want to live in a world like that. I want to live in an abundant world where we're all kind to each other and we work hard, and our value is based on the way that we work and the way that we innovate and the risks that we take.
Natalie, that was so beautifully said. Your perspective and your insights are so, so appreciated. What you want for the world, where you're coming from, everything is just so refreshing. Thank you for coming on this show. For everyone who's listening, definitely follow Natalie. I'm sure most people here already are, but her latest episode of Hard Money Show, the podcast with Alex Epstein, is also worth listening to. Your content is amazing. What you're doing is amazing, as one of the leading voices in this space. So we really appreciate you coming on. And thanks again.
Thank you, Nicole. I really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone, for listening. And I really look forward to hearing from you guys. Thank you.